The sun rose over the Chosin Reservoir on November 27, 1950, revealing a landscape of brutal beauty. Mountains ringed the frozen water, their peaks already white with snow. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero during the night, and it was still falling. The men of the 1st Marine Division, spread out in positions around the reservoir, had no idea that this day would mark the beginning of the most savage battle in Marine Corps history, a 17-day nightmare that would test them beyond anything they had ever imagined. The Marines were confident that morning. The war seemed nearly won. Just 2 months earlier, they had been fighting desperately to hold the Busan perimeter in the south. Then came the Incheon landing, the brilliant amphibious assault that cut North Korean supply lines and turned the tide. The North Korean army had collapsed. UN forces raced north toward the Chinese border. General MacArthur promised the troops would be home by Christmas. Intelligence insisted the Chinese would not intervene in the war. But intelligence was catastrophically wrong. At Chosin Reservoir, the Marines were dangerously spread out. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments, about 8,000 men, were at Yudam-ni, a small village on the west side of the reservoir. They had orders to attack west the next morning. The 1st Marine Regiment was strung out along the only road, the main supply route that ran south from Yudam-ni down to Hagaru-ri, then further south to Coldest, and eventually to the coast. At Hagaru-ri, there were about 3,000 Marines and Army troops. This village was the division command post and the location where engineers were frantically building an airstrip. Between Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri, exactly 14 miles by that winding mountain road, a single Marine company held a critical mountain pass. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 240 men, were dug in on a hill overlooking Toktong Pass. South of Hagaru-ri, more Marines held positions at Coldest. And east of the reservoir, elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division were spread out along the eastern shore. The Marines did not know that surrounding them in the mountains were 10 Chinese divisions, roughly 120,000 men. The Chinese 9th Army Group had moved into position with extraordinary stealth. They traveled at night, hid during the day, maintained radio silence, and left no traces that American aerial reconnaissance could detect. They wore quilted uniforms that blended with the snow. They endured the same killing cold that would plague the Marines, but they had been ordered to destroy the 1st Marine Division, and they were willing to accept enormous casualties to accomplish that mission. As darkness fell on November 27, the temperature plummeted further. It dropped to 20 below zero, then 25 below. The Marines at Yudam-ni settled into their positions for the night. Some had managed to dig shallow foxholes, though the frozen ground made digging nearly impossible. Others built sangars, walls of rocks that provided some protection. They wore whatever cold weather gear they had, which for many was inadequate. The issue of winter clothing had not caught up with the rapid advance north. Some men had parkas, but others wore only field jackets over their uniforms. Sleeping bags were in short supply. Men huddled together for warmth, 2 or 3 sharing a single bag. Around 9:30 that night, the Chinese attacked. The assault began with bugles and whistles echoing through the mountains, an eerie sound that chilled the blood of men already frozen by the temperature. Then came the mortars, exploding among the Marine positions. And then the Chinese infantry, waves of men in quilted uniforms appearing out of the darkness, firing rifles and burp guns, throwing grenades, coming straight at the Marine lines. The Marines fought back with everything they had. Rifles cracked, machine guns hammered, mortars fired illumination rounds that turned the night into flickering daylight. But the cold had already begun affecting their weapons. M1 rifles jammed, machine guns seized up. The oil in the weapons had thickened to the consistency of glue in the extreme cold. Marines frantically worked bolts by hand, trying to clear jams, while Chinese soldiers closed to within grenade range. At Yudam-ni, the Chinese hit the Marines from multiple directions. They infiltrated between positions, appearing suddenly in the rear areas, attacking headquarters units and artillery positions. The fighting was desperate and confused. In the darkness and blowing snow, it was hard to tell friend from enemy. Marines fired at muzzle flashes and shadowy figures. Chinese soldiers blew bugles to coordinate their attacks and to spread fear. The sound of those bugles would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Marines held, but barely. All through that first night, November 27 into November 28, the attacks continued. Units became isolated. Communication broke down. Men fought in small groups, defending positions against waves of attackers. The Chinese absorbed casualties that would have broken any Western army. When one wave was cut down, another came behind it. They kept coming. At Fox Company's position on Toktong Pass, 14 miles south of Yudam-ni, the Chinese attacked with the same fury. Captain William Barber commanded Fox Company, and he knew his position was critical. The pass was the only route between Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri. If the Chinese took the pass, they would cut the road and isolate the Marines at Yudam-ni. Barber had positioned his men on the slopes of a hill designated as 1403, its height in meters. The hill overlooked the road through the pass. The Chinese came at Fox Company in overwhelming numbers. They hit the company from three sides, trying to overrun the position. The Marines fought desperately. Barber moved among his men, directing fire, encouraging them, refusing to take cover despite the intense fire. Machine gun teams fired until their weapons seized up from the cold, then frantically worked to get them operating again. Riflemen fired until their ammunition ran low, then took ammunition from the dead and wounded. The fighting at Fox Hill was savage. Chinese soldiers reached the Marine positions. Men fought hand-to-hand with rifles, bayonets, knives, fists, anything they could use. The Chinese were determined to take the hill. The Marines were equally determined to hold it. All through the night, the battle raged. The ground was frozen, so when men fell wounded, they bled onto ice. The temperature continued to drop. By dawn on November 28, Fox Company still held its position, but at terrible cost. The company had suffered heavy casualties. Captain Barber himself had been wounded, shot through the hip, but he refused evacuation and continued to command. Dead Marines lay in the positions where they had fallen. Wounded men shivered in the cold, their blood freezing on their uniforms. The survivors were exhausted, nearly out of ammunition, and they knew the Chinese would attack again the next night. At Yudam-ni, dawn revealed the full scale of the battle. The Marines had held their positions, but the perimeter was now completely surrounded. Chinese soldiers occupied the high ground on all sides. Any movement drew fire. The Marines at Yudam-ni now understood their situation. They were cut off, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them by perhaps 10-1, and the temperature was continuing to drop. The thermometer showed 30 below zero on the morning of November 28. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines at Yudam-ni. He was a tough, experienced officer who had fought in World War II. He looked at his men that morning and saw exhaustion, cold and fear, but also determination. The Marines had fought through the night and held. Now they had to figure out how to survive and fight their way out. The plan to attack west was obviously cancelled. Division headquarters at Hagaru-ri, 14 miles south, ordered the regiments at Yudam-ni to fight their way back to Hagaru, but the road was cut. The Chinese held the high ground along the entire route, and Fox Company at Toktong Pass was barely hanging on. Before the main force could move, the road had to be opened. November 28 was spent reorganizing, redistributing ammunition, treating the wounded, and preparing for another night of Chinese attacks. The Marines knew they were coming. Supply aircraft tried to drop ammunition and medical supplies, but many of the bundles landed outside the perimeter, in Chinese-held territory. Some supplies were retrieved in daring missions, Marines running out under fire to grab bundles and drag them back. Other supplies were lost. The wounded presented a terrible problem. There were hundreds of casualties from the first night's fighting. The battalion aid stations were overwhelmed. Men lay on the frozen ground, some with improvised shelters, most exposed to the elements. Corpsmen worked frantically to treat the wounded, but in the extreme cold, medical supplies froze. Plasma froze solid. Morphine syrettes froze. Blood for transfusions froze. Corpsemen carried morphine next to their skin to keep it liquid. They did what they could, but in those conditions, many men who might have survived their wounds died from shock and cold. As night fell on November 28, the temperature dropped even further, 40 below zero. At this temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath forms ice crystals that hang in the air. Metal becomes so cold that bare skin sticks to it and tears away. The Marines prepared for the Chinese attacks they knew were coming. Attacks came at full dark, around 10 p.m. Once again, bugles and whistles, mortars and small arms fire, and waves of Chinese infantry. The Chinese attacked the same positions they had hit the night before, trying to break through and destroy the Marine regiments. At Yudam-ni, the fighting was even more intense than the first night. The Chinese seemed to have unlimited manpower. When one attack was beaten back, another followed. The Marines fired until their weapons jammed, cleared them, and fired again. Ammunition began to run critically low in some positions. Machine gun crews kept their weapons firing through sheer determination and ingenuity. They stripped all the lubricants out of the guns, running them dry. This caused excessive wear, but it was better than having a frozen weapon. They rotated crew members frequently because hands became too numb to operate the weapons. Some crews urinated on the bolts to provide liquid that would not freeze immediately, anything to keep the guns firing. At Fox Hill, the Chinese attacked again with even greater force. They had brought up more troops during the day, and now they were determined to take the position. Captain Barber, wounded and barely able to walk, continued to command. He moved around the perimeter on his hands and knees, checking positions, encouraging men, directing fire. The Marines were down to critical levels of ammunition. Men were taking ammunition from the dead. One Marine at Fox Hill, Private Hector Cafferata, became legendary that night. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall and powerfully built. When Chinese soldiers broke through into his position, Cafferata fought them off with his rifle, his entrenching tool, and finally with his bare hands. He picked up Chinese grenades and threw them back before they exploded. When he ran out of ammunition, he used his rifle as a club. He fought for hours, was wounded multiple times, but kept fighting. His actions helped hold a critical section of the line. The night of November 28-29 was the longest of the battle for many Marines. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant attacks, all combined to push men to their limits. Some men froze to death in their positions. Others were so badly frostbitten they could not function as soldiers anymore. Fingers and toes froze. Men could not feel their hands or feet. They continued to fight on pure willpower, but the cold was winning. Dawn on November 29 brought no relief. The Chinese attack slackened with daylight, but they did not stop. Snipers fired from the surrounding hills. Mortars fell intermittently on the Marine positions, and the cold remained brutal, 35 to 40 below zero throughout the day. Marines tried to rotate men into heated tents for a few minutes at a time, just to warm up enough to maintain function, but there were not enough heated spaces for everyone. At division headquarters in Hagaru-ri, General Oliver Smith faced a crisis. His division was split into 3 parts. The bulk of his force was surrounded at Yudam-ni. Fox Company was isolated at Toktong Pass. His headquarters and the partially completed airstrip were at Hagaru-ri, which itself was under attack. The Chinese had attacked Hagaru-ri the night of November 28, trying to take the village and destroy the airstrip. The attack had been beaten back, but more attacks were coming. Smith knew he had to consolidate his forces, but getting the regiments from Yudam-ni back to Hagaru meant fighting down that 14-mile road through Chinese positions, and first, it meant relieving Fox Company. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis was given the mission of fighting through to Fox Company. He would take his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, about 1,000 men, and attack overland across the mountains to relieve Fox Company at Toktong Pass. It was a desperate gamble. The battalion would have to leave the road, climb over 2 mountain ridges in the dark and the cold, while fighting through Chinese positions. But it was the only way to open the road. Davis briefed his officers on the afternoon of November 29. They would move out after dark, march overland, guided by a marine aviator who had flown over the terrain and thought he knew the route. They would carry their weapons and ammunition, but leave everything else behind. No vehicles, no heavy equipment. The wounded who could not walk would have to stay behind. It was a brutal decision, but necessary. Every able-bodied man was needed for the fight. At 9:30 p.m. on November 29, Davis's battalion moved out from Yudam-ni. They climbed up the ridges west of the village, immediately leaving the road behind. The cold was staggering, 40 below zero. Men struggled through snow that was knee-deep in places, carrying rifles and machine guns and ammunition. The climb was exhausting. Men fell, got up, kept moving. Behind them, the Marines still at Yudam-ni prepared for another night of Chinese attacks. Davis's battalion moved through the darkness, guided by compass and by the aviator's memory of the terrain. They encountered Chinese positions on the ridges. Firefights erupted in the darkness, confused engagements where it was hard to tell directions or see more than a few yards. The Marines fought through each position and kept moving. Men began to fall out, unable to keep up. Some were wounded. Others were simply exhausted or suffering from frostbite. The column stretched out. Battalion cohesion threatened to break down, but Davis pushed them forward. All through the night of November 29-30, Davis's battalion fought across the mountains. It was one of the epic small unit actions of the war, a battalion-sized movement through enemy territory in darkness and extreme cold. Men fell asleep while walking and had to be shaken awake by their buddies. Others suffered frostbite that disabled them. Hands and feet went numb. Men stumbled on, following the man in front of them, trusting their leaders to get them to Fox Company. At Yudam-ni, the Chinese attacked again on the night of November 29-30. The pattern was the same: bugles and whistles, mortars and infantry attacks. The Marines who remained fought them off, but casualties continued to mount. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Wounded men lay in rows, shivering in the cold. Some died during the night, not from their wounds but from the cold. Corpsmen worked through the night, trying to save who they could, but it was a losing battle. The cold was killing men faster than the Chinese. At Fox Hill, the Marines waited through November 29 for relief that did not come. They did not know about Davis's march because radio communication was sporadic at best in the mountains. They knew only that they had to hold one more night. The Chinese attacked Fox Hill again on the night of November 29-30, the third consecutive night. The attacks were not as intense as the previous nights, perhaps because the Chinese had suffered such heavy casualties in the earlier assaults. But the Marines at Fox Hill were down to a handful of effective fighters. Almost everyone was wounded. Ammunition was critically low. Frostbite casualties were extensive. Men could barely move. Captain Barber was still in command, though his wound had worsened and he was in extreme pain. He refused morphine because he needed to stay alert. He knew his company had to hold. If Fox Hill fell, the road would be cut, and the Marines at Yudam-ni would be trapped with no hope of withdrawal. So Fox Company held. Dawn on November 30 found Davis's battalion still fighting through the mountains. They had been moving and fighting for over 10 hours. Men were at the end of their endurance, but Davis pushed them on. They had to reach Fox Company before dark. As the sun rose, they finally saw their objective: Fox Hill, with its Marine positions visible on the slopes. But between the battalion and Fox Hill were more Chinese positions. Davis attacked immediately. There was no time for rest or preparation. The battalion assaulted the Chinese positions between them and Fox Hill. The fighting was fierce. The Chinese knew what the Marines were trying to do and fought to stop them. Marines advanced through snow and over rocks, firing as they moved. Machine gun teams set up, provided covering fire, then displaced forward. It was textbook infantry tactics executed by exhausted men in the worst possible conditions. By mid-afternoon on November 30, Davis's battalion broke through to Fox Company. The Marines on Fox Hill, who had been surrounded and under attack for 3 nights, watched as friendly forces fought their way to their position. Relief was almost overwhelming. Fox Company had held. Now they were no longer alone. But the cost had been terrible. Fox Company had started with 240 men. Now they had less than 100 effective. Captain Barber was barely conscious from his wound and blood loss. The company had suffered over 50% casualties, and almost everyone had some degree of frostbite. Davis's battalion had lost men during the march and the fighting to reach Fox Hill. But the pass was now held in force, and the road could be opened. At Yudam-ni, the Marines prepared to withdraw. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments would move out, fighting their way down the road to Hagaru-ri. But this would not be a retreat. Marines do not retreat. General Smith made that clear. This would be an attack in a different direction. They would attack south, down the road, destroying Chinese forces along the route. The withdrawal from Yudam-ni began on the morning of December 1. It was a massive operation. Over 8,000 Marines, plus hundreds of casualties who would have to be transporting, artillery pieces that had to be moved or destroyed, vehicles and equipment. The column would be miles long, moving down a single narrow road through mountain passes, with Chinese forces on the high ground on both sides. The Marines moved out in order. Combat units led and followed, with headquarters and support units in the middle. The wounded were loaded on trucks. Every vehicle was packed with wounded men. Some were tied on top of trucks because there was no more room inside. The temperature remained well below zero. Wounded men on the trucks were exposed to wind chill that made the already deadly cold even worse. The column moved slowly. The road was icy, narrow, and winding. Vehicles slipped and slid. Some went off the road and had to be abandoned. The Chinese attacked the column from the ridges on both sides. Marines had to fight their way forward and also send units up the ridges to clear Chinese positions. Each mile was paid for in blood and exhaustion. December 1 and 2 saw the Yudam-ni column fighting down the road. At night, they would stop, form a perimeter, and fight off Chinese attacks. During the day, they would move a few more miles, fighting continuously. The Marines were exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before. They had been fighting for 4 days and nights with almost no sleep, minimal food, and in cold that was literally lethal. Men fell asleep while walking. They would stumble along, eyes closed, until they bumped into the man in front of them. Then they would wake up, walk some more, and fall asleep again. It was a somnambulistic nightmare. Officers and NCOs had to constantly check their men, shake them awake, keep them moving. Anyone who stopped moving for too long in that cold would die. The column reached Hagaru-ri on December 3. The Marines from Yudam-ni staggered into the perimeter at Hagaru. They had fought for 6 days, marched 14 miles through enemy territory in the worst cold imaginable, and brought their wounded with them. They had not left their dead behind either. The bodies of Marines killed in action were tied to vehicles or carried by hand. The Marine Corps does not leave its dead on the battlefield. At Hagaru-ri, there was relative safety. The perimeter was larger, better defended. The airstrip, though not fully completed, was operational. C-47 transport planes were landing, bringing in supplies and ammunition, and flying out the most seriously wounded. The sight of those planes landing and taking off was more than just practical support. It was psychological proof that they were not completely isolated, that there was a connection to the outside world. But Hagaru-ri was not safe. The Chinese attacked the perimeter every night. The village itself had been attacked, while the column from Yudam-ni was fighting its way south. Army units from east of the reservoir, Task Force Faith, had been destroyed trying to fight their way to Hagaru. Survivors from that disaster had straggled into Hagaru, telling stories of their units being overrun, of men freezing to death, of trucks full of wounded being abandoned when the vehicles broke down. The remnants of Task Force Faith were a warning of what could happen. General Smith now had most of his division at Hagaru-ri, but they were still surrounded and still 40 miles from the coast. The next leg of the journey would be from Hagaru-ri to Kotarai, about 11 miles south. The road was cut in several places. The Chinese held positions along the entire route, and there was a particularly difficult section of road where the Chinese had blown a bridge over a gorge. Without that bridge, vehicles could not pass, and without vehicles, the Marines could not move their wounded or their heavy equipment. December 4, 5, and 6 were spent at Hagaru-ri preparing for the next phase of the breakout. The wounded were evacuated by air. The airstrip operated around the clock despite Chinese fire and terrible weather. Planes landed, loaded with wounded, and took off. Some planes were hit by Chinese fire. Others crashed on takeoff because of the ice and snow. But the evacuation continued. Over 4,000 wounded and frostbite casualties were flown out of Hagaru-ri during those 3 days. The Marines also consolidated their forces, redistributed ammunition, and prepared for the march to Koto-ri. They knew it would be another fighting withdrawal, another battle against the Chinese and the cold. The temperature had warmed slightly, rising to around 10 to 15 below zero, which felt almost balmy compared to the 40 below they had experienced. But this was still cold enough to kill, and the Marines were exhausted. On December 6, the column left Hagaru-ri. Once again, a miles-long column of vehicles and marching men moved down the narrow mountain road. The Chinese attacked from the ridges. Marines fought back, advancing up the slopes to clear enemy positions, then returning to the column and moving on. The pattern repeated every few hundred yards. Attack, clear, move, attack again. The blown bridge presented the biggest obstacle. Engineers had constructed a portable bridge section flown in by cargo plane, but installing it under fire in the cold was an enormously difficult task. The engineers worked while Marines provided covering fire. The Chinese knew the importance of the bridge and attacked repeatedly to prevent its installation. But the engineers persevered, and by December 9, the bridge was in place and vehicles began crossing. The column reached Koto-ri on December 7. Another defensive perimeter, another temporary rest. But Koto-ri was still miles from the coast, still surrounded. The Marines had to keep moving. The final leg of the journey would take them from Koto-ri down to Hungnam at the base of the mountains, and then to the coast at Hungnam. Between Koto-ri and Hungnam was some of the most difficult terrain yet. The road descended nearly 2,500 feet in elevation over a distance of about 10 miles. It wound down the mountains in a series of switchbacks and narrow defiles. Chinese forces held positions above the road. This would be the last major obstacle. The withdrawal from Koto-ri began on December 8. The Marines fought down the mountain road, clearing Chinese positions as they went. The fighting was continuous, but less intense than earlier in the campaign. The Chinese 9th Army Group had suffered catastrophic casualties. Entire divisions had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The cold had killed as many Chinese soldiers as Marine bullets had. Chinese commanders had lost control of some units. Supply lines were non-existent. The offensive power of the Chinese force was broken. But the Chinese still fought. They attacked the column, tried to ambush it, fired on it from the ridges. Marines continued to take casualties. Men who had survived 2 weeks of fighting were killed in the final miles. Frostbite continued to disable men. Some lost consciousness from exhaustion and cold and had to be placed on vehicles. The column kept moving. On December 10, the lead elements of the column reached Hungnam. They were out of the mountains. The road to the coast was open. Behind them, the rest of the division continued to fight its way down. By December 11, the entire 1st Marine Division had reached the coast at Hungnam. At Hungnam, the Navy had assembled a massive evacuation fleet. The 7th Fleet provided offshore fire support, battleships and cruisers hammering Chinese positions inland. Transports and cargo ships waited to load the Marines and their equipment. And refugees, tens of thousands of Korean civilians who knew that remaining behind meant death or persecution under communist rule, crowded the port area hoping to be evacuated. The Marines boarded ships over several days. They brought their equipment, their wounded, and their dead. Bodies of Marines killed in action were loaded aboard ships to be returned home for burial. The Marines also helped load Korean refugees. Over 100,000 civilians were evacuated from Hungnam along with the military forces. On December 24, Christmas Eve 1950, the last UN forces left Hungnam. Engineers demolished the port facilities to prevent their use by Chinese forces. The evacuation was complete. The 1st Marine Division had fought its way out of the trap at Chosin Reservoir, had survived 17 days of continuous combat in the worst weather conditions any American force had ever faced, and had reached the coast with their wounded, their equipment, and their dead. The cost had been terrible. Official figures listed over 700 Marines killed in action at Chosin. Several thousand were wounded, but these numbers did not capture the full extent of the casualties. Frostbite had disabled thousands more. Some lost fingers or toes, others lost hands or feet. Still others suffered frostbite damage that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Almost every man who fought at Chosin suffered some degree of cold injury. The Chinese casualties were even more staggering. The Chinese 9th Army Group, which had entered the battle with roughly 120,000 men, was destroyed as a fighting force. Estimates of Chinese casualties ranged from 35,000 to over 50,000 killed and wounded, with an additional 30,000 or more non-battle casualties, mostly from the cold. Some Chinese units had frozen to death in their positions before they ever engaged the Marines. Others had been decimated by Marine firepower and airstrikes. The Chinese had failed in their mission to destroy the 1st Marine Division. For the Marines who fought at Chosin, the 17 days from November 27 to December 11 became the defining experience of their lives. They had faced overwhelming odds, had fought in conditions that seemed impossible, and they had survived. They had proven that American Marines could fight and win against any enemy in any conditions. The breakout from Chosin Reservoir became one of the legendary actions in Marine Corps history, spoken of with the same reverence as Belleau Wood and Iwo Jima. But the victory, if it could be called that, came at a price beyond the casualty statistics. Every man who fought at Chosin was changed by the experience. The cold had marked them physically and psychologically. They carried frostbite scars, missing fingers and toes, chronic pain from cold injuries. They carried memories of friends who died, of fighting in the darkness against an enemy that seemed endless, of cold so severe it was a physical presence, an enemy as deadly as the Chinese. In the years after the war, Chosin veterans would gather at reunions. They would tell stories, remember those who did not come home, and try to explain to others what it had been like. But how do you explain 40 below zero to someone who has never experienced it? How do you convey the exhaustion of fighting for days without sleep, of watching friends freeze to death, of continuing to fight when every instinct screams to just stop and rest? The battle at Chosin Reservoir stands as a testament to human endurance and the limits thereof. It demonstrated what trained, disciplined soldiers can accomplish even in the worst circumstances. It showed the importance of leadership, of unit cohesion, of the bonds between men who fight together. It also showed the terrible cost of war, the way that combat breaks bodies and minds, the sacrifices demanded of those who serve. The cold at Chosin killed and maimed, but it did not break the Marines. They fought through it, survived it, and came out the other side. For 17 days, from November 27 to December 11, 1950, they fought the coldest battle in American history. They fought the Chinese. They fought the cold. And they won. The price was terrible, but they won. That is their legacy. That is the story of Chosin Reservoir, told day by day. A story of courage and suffering, of death and survival, of Marines who faced the impossible and prevailed.